Hello.
Oh, hey, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Good. Excited.
Very good. Excellent. No, thrilled that you're doing this. Wonderful. And well, you could see the setup from last week. We get a select audience, but they're keen and interested. So that's it's all good.
Yes, it's very exciting to be able to share the work in this venue.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the strange Agaday listing. I'm really not sure how that happened. I went back to Jack Sasson, but unfortunately he doesn't like to repost. And I guess, as he pointed out, it's really about getting people to turn up rather than they got the link, and that's the main thing. So hopefully the G won't make too much difference.
Well, I suppose it's one of those things that with this topic, I'll probably continually be up against that king,
Yes.
And that kind of the mistaking one for the other and everything. So it's good training, I think.
Oh yes, you might have to sort of italicize kin so people sort of look at it rather than just as I don't know. Anyway, all to the good, because you'll be able to correct it now with your title. Do you want to try your sharing? I think I might need to give you permission to do that, but let me just it's not doing that. Hang on a moment. What's happening here? Deny. Right. Okay, all participants. Right, you should now have authority to.
Okay. Let me just. Sorry, I was just playing with one of the slides. Okay, so this should work.
Yep, looking good. So if you want to. And yep, perfect. All there. Good. You want to just bounce forward a bit and just make sure it's, yep, good. Oh, that's a lovely map.
Oh yeah, it's I actually it's from the British Museum website. So
oh, is it? Oh, right. Oh, it's the Assurbanipal one. Okay. Oh, well, that's
exactly.
good to know.
I bring it up in every presentation I do because it's so effective, I think. So
yes, oh, very clear. I must borrow that immediately. Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think that's all.
Looking great.
So shall I stop sharing for now?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's up to you. It might be quite good just to leave it up in a way, as if on the front page, unless it's,
okay.
And then when people come in, they'll see.
Yeah, I just need to double check the order of the last.
Okay, no, we'll unshare then. And
I don't need to stop sharing for
all
that.
right.
It's a really minor thing, but just if I'm looking down for a second.
It's all right. We've got plenty of time, and got another 10 minutes, and no one can see anything till I let them in. So it's
That's great.
How are you doing?
Great. Just working on the final image. So I think that can be like I have so many images of the same monument on this PowerPoint that it's hard to find.
I probably need to let people in now.
Yeah, that's all right. I am ready.
Right.
I just go back and then I will just go and fill up my glass of water. So I'll turn my camera off, but I'm still here.
Very good.
So I'll put that this email and that. Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, do you want to put it on the first
Right.
slide and then
Yes.
see that?
Great. Great.
Super, very good.
I'll just turn my camera off and I'll be back here.
Good.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a few minutes to ensure all our audience is in place, and then we'll make a start in a few minutes. Very good. Well, welcome everyone to the third in our lecture series focused on art history and visual cultures, organized, of course, by ARWA, and this is one of the Archaeology in Action lectures. So I'm delighted to welcome you all, and wonderful to see so many friends and a large audience here today. So thank you for coming. Just a quick notice in advance of my introduction to today's speaker, and that there's a change in the schedule in the program. There won't actually be a lecture next week. We usually have one every Friday, but not next week. That's because it was going to clash with the ICANI conference, and we thought it best you had an opportunity to focus there. So Sarah Graf will, in fact, be talking on the 30th of June rather than next week. So still an opportunity to hear her. And so our next lecture will take place on the 2nd of June, which will be Elizabeth Knott talking on composing cylinder seal scenes. So we look forward to that. But for the moment, I'm delighted to welcome to speak today Talah Anderson. She's final year in her DPhil at Wolfson College in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford. And full disclosure, I'm one of her supervisors with Professor Jacob Dahl. Talah is very experienced academic, having done her MPhil at the University of Cambridge in Assyriology, and before that she was at the University of St Andrews. She's already got a number of publications to her name, ranging from the sorts of studies focusing on what we'll hear about today, but also interestingly on reception. So she's written, for example, on Oscar Wilde's Salome, and receiving Ishtar through the seven veils. So much for you to watch out from. But today I'm delighted to say she'll be talking to us on divine kinship under Esarhaddon. And Talah, thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. Okay. My doctoral project, titled Divine Kinship at the Assyrian Royal Court, is primarily a study of the modeling of ideal social relations in the context of the late Assyrian Empire. In particular, I aim to reconstruct how interrelatedness within and between differentiated kin groups was experienced and shaped in physical space through representation, and especially through the selective visualization of an individual or group's relative proximity to the gods. For this, my key case studies are monumental freestanding and relief sculptures, which were intended to be experienced as enduring representations of the king and other key actors in relationship with and in the service of the divine, as well as textual sources that describe or otherwise relate to rituals in which the experience of the gods would have been agented. I am chiefly interested in when and why particular divine personas show up in the sources, and what roles they seem to be playing in relation to human actors when they do. It is my contention that insofar as it is currently possible to say, the foregrounding of divinely interrelated kin relations was an important component of the visual expression of Assyrian rulership under the Sargonids, and that approaching the material and textual record through the lens of kinship rather than kingship has the potential to radically shift its reading. In this presentation, I hope to begin to make this case through an exploration of Esarhaddon's steles from Zincirli, so ancient Samar, and Tell Ahmar, so ancient Tilbarsip, which most notably celebrate Esarhaddon's landmark victory over the Pharaoh Taharqa at Memphis in 671 BC, as well as Esarhaddon's naming of two heirs, Assurbanipal and Šamaš-šumu-ukīn, to succeed him in Assyria and Babylonia, respectively, the year prior. Previous studies of the steles have focused mostly on their obverse reliefs and accompanying inscriptions, arguing convincingly that these monuments function to convey political messages about the might of the Assyrian king to the provincial capitals that they were erected in. In this presentation, I wish to propose that the Crown Prince Assurbanipal's divine right to succeed Esarhaddon is a fully integrated aspect of the monument's distributed message. To begin to make this case, it is useful to first situate the relationship between the king and the crown prince within the broader context of Assyrian iconography and ideology. In the light of the recent devastation in southern and central Turkey and northern Syria, it is, however, especially pertinent to draw attention to the correspondence of the ancient sites to the recently impacted areas. Zincirli, for example, is just 8 miles away from the epicenter of the first earthquake, which struck on the 6th of February and has taken so many thousands upon thousands of lives. Identified by his distinctive headdress or pitutu with 2 tasseled bands hanging down his back, the crown prince appears consistently in the wall reliefs from the palaces built at the successive Assyrian royal capitals of Nimrud, so ancient Kalhu, Horsabad, ancient Dur-Sharrukin, and Nineveh, as well as in the wall paintings attributed to Tiglath-Pileser III from the Assyrian palace at Tell Ahmar. In these palatial contexts, the crown prince's primary role is to stand before the king, functioning as his intermediary, whether participating in the trampling of enemies, introducing Assyrian dignitaries and foreign tributaries, or standing at the head of booty parades. Even in the earliest examples, the visual relationship between the king and the crown prince is maintained through their comparable dress elements and spatial proximity to one another. Perhaps in part due to the circumstances surrounding Sargon II's suspected usurpation, the crown prince is represented more frequently than ever in the palace release from Horsabad, moving the focus away from at least the recent past and toward the future, in keeping with Sargon's self-presentation in his royal inscriptions as being the founder of a new dynasty. In the wake of the regicide of Sargon's successor, Sennacherib, a conspiracy that is thought to have involved at least one of his rivaling sons, and possibly even the future king himself, Esarhaddon, like his grandfather Sargon, also came to power in Assyria at a moment of crisis. Esarhaddon's own ideological approach to the issue of the succession has, of course, been much discussed in Assyriology, particularly with respect to the many Ade or loyalty oath tablet fragments that have notably been found at Nimrud, as well as more recently at Tell Tayinat, the ancient Assyrian province of Kulenia. While in a purely legalistic sense, these documents can be seen to witness the binding in loyalty of elites from across the empire to Assurbanipal as Esarhaddon's foremost successor, written as well as pictorial elements of these documents work together to express divine involvement in the crown prince's succession. Curiously, however, the multi-layered religious aspect of the Ade has rarely been connected to the prince's inclusion on Esarhaddon's steles. So before we return to Esarhaddon's monuments, it is worth briefly revisiting these important documents and their material reality now. The Nimrud version of Esarhaddon's succession Ade is principally known from over 350 fragments, estimated to have originally constituted at least 9 tablets, found scattered in a suite or throne room connected to Azida, the Nabu temple at Nimrud, during the British excavations led by Max Mallowan in 1955. The best preserved and most extensive attestation to any known Ade, the reconstructed text spans 670 lines regarding an oath of allegiance to the Crown Prince Assurbanipal, which the tablet colophons inform was sworn between the 16th and 18th of the month of Ayaru, 672 BC. Aside from scribal errors and slight variations, so for example, each tablet names a different vassal ruler that was to enter into the agreement, the inscription is thought to have been more or less identical across the 9 reconstructed exemplars. Significantly, the Ade was sworn in the presence of all the gods of the empire, who were enlisted as divine witnesses to the oath as well as its enforcers. The text includes a lengthy series of curses entreating divine retribution on anyone who would betray what was sworn. A prohibition against damaging the Ade tablets was also written, and the text instructs that the Ade tablets were to be set up and revered as divine objects themselves, since the tablets were individually sealed with the seal of the god Ashur. The partly preserved imagery and inscribed elements reveal that Ashur's seal was effectively comprised of 3 seals from different periods of Assyrian history: an Old Assyrian seal, a Middle Assyrian seal, and one from the time of Sennacherib. The central seal impression likely dates to the 19th century BC, or is at least an archaizing seal in the style of the period. The glyptic shows an interceding goddess in the presence of a worshipful ruler, while the image is typical of an introduction scene. No higher ranking deity is pictured, but the seal's inscription identifies it as belonging to Ashur of the house of the city. The detail of the inscription on the rightmost seal has not survived, but the glyptic is well preserved. The scene depicts 2 high-ranking deities, likely Ashur and Adad, standing upon quadrupeds, while an interceding deity introduces a kneeling figure performing the standard Assyrian Ubana Taratsu or finger-pointing praying gesture. The seal is attributed to the 13th or 12th centuries BC due to the resemblance between the figure of the kneeling ruler pictured on the cultic pedestal attributed to Tukulti-Ninurta I. In Sennacherib's seal, the Ubana Taratsu gesture is replaced by the Babylonian Apalabanu or nose-rubbing praying gesture, which the king performs while stood between 2 deities, most plausibly Ashur and his consort Mulissu, who, like Ashur in the Middle Assyrian seal, stand atop quadrupeds and appear to hold the rod and or ring emblems of rulership. The inscription attached to Sennacherib's seal identifies it as Ashur's seal of destinies, connecting it to the Babylonian tablet of destinies concept that is thought to have been incorporated into Assyrian religion along with the Apalabanu as part of Sennacherib's religious reforms following his sack of Babylon in 689 BC. According to the Babylonian mythological explanatory poems Anzu and Enuma Elish, the writing on the tablet of destinies, and so its possessor, determines all future outcomes. As has been argued quite recently by Kazuko Watanabe, the indexing of this tradition via the Ade sealings, when understood within this cultural framework, therefore functioned to transform the written oath in support of Assurbanipal's succession into his cosmic destiny. And the usage of the seal attributed to Sennacherib, in conjunction with the historicizing Old and Middle Assyrian seals, rooted this destiny within the millennia-old dynastic relationship between the gods and the ruler, from his humbler beginnings as the vice-regent of Ashur to the more recent moment of grandiose imperialism. Certainly, this expressed more than a millennium's worth of divine support for the succession visually, made especially apparent through the development to represent Sennacherib standing face to face, or better, face to ring, with the foremost divine couple in his seal, a motif which is otherwise monumentalized on his rock reliefs at Kinnis, Multi, and Feder. The physical layout and materiality of the tablets would have also helped to facilitate their veneration through their display. While cuneiform tablets are typically rotated through their horizontal axis from the obverse to the reverse, thus requiring a sort of flipping motion to continue reading them, the Ade tablets would have been rotated through the vertical axis, so requiring a sort of turning motion, meaning that the text could be read or viewed by walking around the display tablets. And these tablets were, of course, especially large and thick, contributing to the experience of their splendor. An important variant of the Nimrud Ade was excavated further from the imperial center at Tell Tayinat in southeastern Turkey during the Canadian excavations directed by Timothy Harrison in 2009. Like the Nimrud exemplars, the Tell Tayinat tablet fragments similarly record an Ade supporting the future succession of the Crown Prince Assurbanipal, sworn sometime between the 16th and 19th of Ayaru, so adding a range of just 1 day later than the Nimrud exemplars, though it is, of course, possible that this additional day could be an error. Crucially, while the Nimrud exemplars were sworn between Esarhaddon and his foreign vassals from the Zagros region, the Tayinat variant was sworn between the king and the Assyrian governor of that region. This adds further credence to the claim made in the text that the Ade implicated every subject of the empire, whether natively Assyrian or otherwise. Hence, it has been concluded that Esarhaddon aimed to secure universal fealty for his successor in what has been theorized as the only known instance of cuneiform mass production in antiquity. Furthermore, and most importantly for our purposes, the Tayinat Ade, like the Nimrud version, was a similarly monumental religious document found atop a temple dais and sealed with the seal of Ashur. Therefore, the existence of the Tayinat version evidences not only the exportation of Esarhaddon's bureaucracy, but also his religious message about the crown princes beyond the Assyrian heartlands and into the empire's provinces, as I propose do his steles from Zincirli and Tell Ahmar. As mentioned, previous studies of the steles have primarily understood the reliefs and accompanying inscriptions as vessels of political propaganda. Taking account of the specific political circumstances that shaped power relations between Imperial Assyria and ancient Samal and Tilbarsip in the 7th century BC, it has been suggested that the steles communicate contextually relevant messages, encouraging either the total submission or continued fidelity of their localities, depending on their past records of good or bad behavior. Yet this reading may be further modulated by considering the intended purpose of the steles as monuments that were expressly dedicated to and primarily intended for the viewership of the gods. Royal steles, as either cliff or freestanding monuments, have a long and coherent tradition in 1st millennium BC Assyria. Carved with the image of the king, usually surrounded by the emblems of the gods, as well as often an accompanying inscription recounting his royal deeds performed on their behalf, these monuments typically commemorate and demonstrate the king's close relationship with the tutelary deities in his role as their foremost agent. This explains the focus on construction and conquest in the accompanying inscriptions. The king is the one who sanctifies the physical environment through its transformation. But Esarhaddon's steles, at least insofar as it's currently possible to say, would seem to be unique within this Assyrian visual tradition for the incorporation of royal sons into the compositions. So how to properly account for this innovation? In the context of his unique arrangements for the succession, the unusual appearance of both of Esarhaddon's heirs on the side panels of the Zincirli and Tell Ahmar steles has previously been taken as a visual parenthetical statement to the imagery's main statement of Assyrian dominance. In other words, the prince's representation in the compositions has essentially been interpreted in isolation from the obverse action and understood as making an almost separate point about the succession. So the king subdues the foreign enemies and, as is custom, salutes the deities on the obverse, while the future kings stand in wait either side. However, if one actually pictures themselves standing before and even walking round each of these monuments, it quickly becomes apparent that the reliefs would be seen not only from a strictly frontal or left or even right side facing view, but also from the diagonal perspectives. Therefore, it makes more sense to take the prince's inclusion in the steles as an integral rather than a parenthetical part of each monument's message, because the diagonal views show that both are brought into visual relationship with the monument's main protagonist, the king. Weathering has obscured much of the detail of the relief work on the Tell Ahmar citadel and gateway steles. However, the Assyrian heir can still be identified by his tasseled headdress, whereas the Babylonian heir is identified by his distinctive sash, otherwise seen on Neo-Babylonian kudurus. Thus, it is still possible to see that, as was the case in the earlier palatial reliefs, Esarhaddon continues to face the individual in the tasseled headband or the Assyrian crown prince in all three steles. Even when the direction Esarhaddon faces changes from right, as on the Zincirli stele, to left on both Tell Ahmar steles, the panel that the Assyrian crown prince is represented on changes correspondingly, so that the hierarchical visual relations between Esarhaddon and his two heirs are always maintained. Understood within the context of the earlier Assyrian representations of the relationship between the Assyrian king and the Assyrian crown prince, it is clear to see that the visual model for the representation of their relationship in the palatial reliefs has been transposed to the steles. Thus, it becomes clear that, as is the case in the Ade texts, the superior position of Assurbanipal over Šamaš-šumu-ukīn is also stressed visually in the steles. While Šamaš-šumu-ukīn's role is to stand behind the king, comparable to the position of the fan bearers in some of the earlier mentioned reliefs, showing Ashurnazirpal II and Sennacherib with their crown princes from Nimrud and Nineveh, Assurbanipal's role is to stand in front of and directly engage with the king. Like the Assyrian crown princes in the earlier imagery then, Assurbanipal also has a participatory role to play in the action depicted on the obverse of the Zincirli and Tell Ahmar steles. This is made more evident when one considers the visually paralleled relations between the senior and junior Assyrian rulers and the senior and junior foreign captives. The taller captive is conventionally identified as Abdi Milkuti, the executed king of Sidon, based on the Tell Ahmar citadel steles inscription, which Barbara Porter has pointed out actually inscribes his name below his image, as well as his depiction on the Zincirli stele with a pointed beard and on all three steles, a distinctly non-Assyrian conical cap. The more diminutive captive is conventionally identified as the crown prince Ushanakhuru, the Pharaoh Taharqa's heir, primarily on the basis of his racialized facial features, distinct beardlessness and Kushite cap with uraeus, as well as the Zincirli steles inscription. It is important to grasp the ideological significance of Ushanachuru's presence on the steles, as it is through his subjugated body that Assurbanipal's co-participatory role in the exercise of Assyrian rulership is chiefly expressed. The Zincirli stele inscription explains that in the aftermath of his battle against Taharqa, Esarhaddon carried off to Assyria the defeated pharaoh's women of the palace, his enclosed women, Ushanakhuru, his crown prince, and the rest of his sons and his daughters. Like the Assyrian representations and accounts of the theft of material possessions, animals, humans, and deities, the ideological significance of which has been well addressed, the abduction of Taharqa's women, designated heir, and possible other heirs functions similarly ideologically to support continued Assyrian sovereignty. While not much territory was gained in Egypt and Taharqa had managed to get away from Esarhaddon, Esarhaddon's removal of his significant family members from Egypt allowed him to essentially snuff out the future of Taharqa's dynasty. Through the relative spatial positioning of Assurbanipal in relation to Esarhaddon and Ushanakhuru on the steles, this all-important achievement of Esarhaddon's, as well as being described in the Zincirli stele inscription, is also represented visually. Inasmuch as Assurbanipal's visual relationship with Esarhaddon serves to make a statement about his place in the Assyrian succession, his position in relation to Ushanakhuru seems to make a statement about his authority over the Egyptian crown prince and so the future of the Egyptian succession. This is reinforced by the coiled leash in Esarhaddon's hand, which at once serves to subdue the captives and at the same time bears striking resemblance to the ring associated with the bestowal of kingship by the gods, which is perhaps originally in itself the measuring line or leash, as seen in the relief from Nimrud depicting the winged disc between the king and the crown prince shown earlier. This would seem to articulate the overall message that which subdues Taharqa's heir elevates Esarhaddon's, whose duty it will be to hold the leash on behalf of the Assyrian gods in the near future. And this latter notion is reinforced by Ushanakhuru's rendering on the stele wearing the uraeus crown that is itself a depiction of the Egyptian goddess Wadjet, who through Ushanakhuru's capture is therefore also relegated to the service of the Assyrian deities. Perhaps due to Samal's closer proximity to Egypt, or simply the Zincirli stele's more complete condition, the visual relationship between both captives and the senior and junior rulers seems to be further elaborated on this monument. Thus, while Assurbanipal's eyes are aligned with Esarhaddon's royal scepter, seemingly in reference to his future exercise of kingship on behalf of the gods, and comparable to how Sennacherib's eyes meet Ashur's ring in the Seal of Destinies, his feet are raised to stand at the level of Ushanakhru's royal cap or neck, depending on the angle, a detail that seems to have been overlooked in the drawing. And the argument for this foot alignment being an intentional choice may be further supported by the observation discussed already by Porter and Nathan Morello that Esarhaddon's own feet on the obverse of the monument are aligned with a passage of the inscription that actually describes him as the trampler of the non-submissive, creating a very interesting image-word interplay that also extends around the side panels of the monument. To point out another visual similarity between the steles and the earlier imagery then, in the manner of the relief attributed to Tiglath-Pileser III from Nimrud that shows the crown prince gesturing over a fallen foe while the king treads on his neck. The Zincirli stele, and in a less articulated sense, both Tell Ahmar steles, similarly express the notion that the Assyrian king and crown prince have a synergistic role to play in the proper exercising of Assyrian rulership. The Assyrian king and crown prince may thus be understood as two sides of the same coin. There is therefore no need for the Babylonian and Assyrian crown princes to be seen at once from their positions on the side panels, because at any given moment, the would-be Babylonian ruler is already in relationship with a superior agent of the gods. As we have seen, the Zincirli and Tell Ahmar steles bear permanent witness in stone to Assurbanipal's entry into the visual realm of the gods, following the defeat of Egypt in 671 and his earlier installation of crown prince. But revisiting the correspondence concerning the arrangements for the oath-swearing ceremonials that were conducted at Azida in ARWA 672, it becomes clear that the attempt to visualize Assurbanipal as being in relationship with the gods was part of a broader ideological strategy that was expressed through rituals as well as through monuments. It is, of course, especially significant that the binding Ade documents were found in connection to the cultic residence of the scribal god Nabu at Azida, given the deity's own kin relations. It has long been thought that the Nimrud Ade was also sworn at Azida, as is evidenced by a letter addressed to Esarhaddon from his astrologer Esarhaddon, among others. The colophons of the Ade tablets suggest that in the end, the oaths were not sworn on the 8th day, but following the suggestion by Esarhaddon given later in the letter from the 15th onwards. In any case, the indication that regardless of the date, the oaths were to be sworn beneath the statues of Bel, so Marduk, and Nabu, near to where the Ade fragments were eventually found, is important. While various deities are appealed to in the text of the Ade, the Nabu temple's coded sensory landscape, that is, its built, decorative, and ritual functions and features, would have emphasized the central importance of Nabu, and by extension his father Marduk, to the participants, not least because of the presence of their cult statues there. In Assyria and Babylonia, as it has now been very convincingly established by scholars working on the Mesopotamian material record, the image or tsalmu was typically conceived not as a likeness or mimetic depiction of the signified, but rather more like a doppelganger, and thus had the potential to distribute and presence a person's or even a deity's agency. After undergoing ritual initiation, cult statues were essentially treated and experienced as ritually empowered material agents. So when the foreign and local authorities swore allegiance to Assurbanipal as the principal successor of Esarhaddon under the statues of Nabu and Marduk, they would have done so in what was represented as the deity's real presence. Through ritual participation, therefore, the swearers of the Ade, and especially Esarhaddon and Assurbanipal, who represented Assyrian kingship present and to come, and were the oath's key initiators and beneficiaries, would have been placed visually, even if only for a moment, in relationship with both deities. While it is impossible to say for certain, and indeed one should perhaps not even think to look for such explicit admission in the textual sources, given the general hesitancy of the Assyrian rulers toward explicit claims to divinity. It is indeed likely, as others have pointed out previously, that the idea that Assurbanipal was the terrestrial equivalent of Nabu and Esarhaddon the equivalent of Marduk would have been communicated through this symbolism, especially considering that Esarhaddon, remedying the policy of Sennacherib, sought to incorporate Marduk into a subservient position to Ashur in Assyrian religion. It has also been pointed out by Beata Pongratz-Leisten that this dynamic would have been further enhanced by the timing of the swearing of the loyalty oaths to coincide with the two princes' involvement in a kurshu or nuptial ritual for Nabu and Tashmetu performed at the same location earlier in the month of Ayaru, which would have provided a striking antecedent for the prince's installation, already therefore visualizing these divine connections. Beginning to make our way back to the initial point of departure, it may be reflected that whereas on the Zincirli and Tell Ahmar steles, the senior-junior pairing of Esarhaddon and Assurbanipal is contrasted with the senior-junior facets of foreign subservience in the figures of Abdi Milkuti and Ushanahuru, throughout the month of Ayaru, the king and crown prince would have been positioned in parallel to these interrelated deities. Returning to the imagery, approaching the steles with an eye for the visualization of Esarhaddon's sanctified relationship with Assurbanipal may offer further clues as to the unresolved question of the potential divine origin of Esarhaddon's leash or nose rope, pictured on the Zincirli stele and described as the nose rope of rulers in the monument's inscription. The nose rope appears in earlier Assyrian imagery, but it has been suggested by Talah Anderson that this motif might ultimately be traced back to late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC representations of the deity Ishtar, especially the rock relief at Saripol-Zahab in Iran's Kermanshah province, and attributed to the Lullabite ruler Anu Banini. The relief is seriously weathered due to his exposure to the elements, but the goddess, identified as Ishtar by the accompanying inscription, can still clearly be seen to deliver the enemies of the king to him. In the absence of concrete proof that Esarhaddon and his executors were influenced by this relief when devising his steles in the 7th century BC, the argument in favor has mostly depended on identifying visual similarities between the compositions. This interpretation may, however, be positively supported by a reintegration of the Zincirli stele inscription. Ishtar is not the only deity mentioned in the inscription, nor even the deity most frequently mentioned. However, taken as a whole, the inscription would seem to prioritize and relate Esarhaddon's martial actions to Ishtar specifically. In addition to the more general references to Ishtar's love for Esarhaddon and explanations of Ishtar's military prowess, the admission that Esarhaddon's march from Ishupri to Memphis takes 15 days, which is of course the numerical value of Ishtar, is in my view a particularly compelling case in favor of Esarhaddon's and Ishtar's equation. While Ishtar is the deity that secures Esarhaddon's victory leading to his supreme rulership in battle, she is also the deity that will continue to act by Esarhaddon's side through the erection of the monument after the battle. The stele is ultimately dedicated to Ashur, but to ensure the preservation of the monument in the event that anyone attempts to remove, damage, or hide it, Esarhaddon further petitions Ishtar in her martial aspect specifically to cause his manliness to become like a woman and essentially bind him at the feet of his enemy. The reference to binding at the end of the inscription, following the earlier reference to Ishtar making the unsubmissive rulers bow down, is certainly intriguing considering that Esarhaddon is actually the one pictured with the binding instrument on the obverse of the monument. And moreover, the fact that this particular malediction is only previously attested under Tukulti-Ninurta I, who seems to also be rendered on the Middle Assyrian Ade ceiling, would further suggest that the Zincirli stele was likewise intended as an integrative monument. The in-the-round interpretation of Esarhaddon's steles advanced here further encourages compositional comparison with the Anu Banini imagery. If in earlier imagery, the recipient of the restrained captives is the king, reflecting the ideological or religious notion that it is the deity who is responsible for his military accomplishments, comparison of the relative position of Assurbanipal to Esarhaddon on the Zincirli stele, when viewed in the round, would seem to indicate a reformulation of divine royal relations. While it is indeed Esarhaddon himself who assumes the role of the goddess in the iconography, the recipient of the captive enemies, the figure Esarhaddon faces, is implicitly the Assyrian crown prince who correspondingly assumes the role of Anu Banini, the recipient king in the iconography. In this sense, the relationship between the Assyrian king and the crown prince would seem to be couched in the visual language associated with the bestowal of divine authority to the ruler by the gods, but without actually compromising the representation of the king's relative position to the gods, hence Assurbanipal's relegation to the steles side panel. In the absence of concrete proof that Esarhaddon was aware of and sought to reference this relief in the 7th century BC, I should state that the argument in favor necessarily remains speculative. However, situating the case that I have made in line with the use of ritual elements to sanctify Esarhaddon's relationship with Assurbanipal through the mythology of Bel and Nabu in Ayaru 672 BC, along with the well-noted endurance of other late 3rd and early 2nd millennium visual motifs into Assyrian royal iconography, would suggest to me that it is likely that Ishtar's mythology is being appealed to similarly, irrespective as to whether Esarhaddon had knowledge of the specific Anubanini relief. In any case, one may conclude that Esarhaddon visually performs Ishtar's divine role of investing the ruler and through the nose rope binding the enemies. Whereas Esarhaddon's massive stature has previously been linked to the idea of Egyptian influence on Assyrian visual representation, it may well be a further marker of the Assyrian king's visual apotheosis within an already elaborated Mesopotamian model of sanctified rulership. While not a god as such then, Esarhaddon can be seen to stand in the footsteps of the goddess and presence her divine prerogative on the stele. Within the context of the discourse concerning how to gender Ishtar's cultic personnel in ancient Mesopotamia, the gender transformation passage at the end of the Zincirli steles inscription has mostly been read apart from the monument's imagery. However, in representing Esarhaddon standing in the role of Ishtar, the reliefs on Esarhaddon's 3 steles offer further insight into the gendering of rulership in Sargonid Assyria. Firstly, this certainly, in my view, incorporates the goddess in the archetypal list of gods and demigods one tends to think of the figure of the Assyrian king seeking comparison with. Though it has been shown that Esarhaddon and Assurbanipal in particular legitimated their military activities by appealing to Ishtar in her role as cosmological warrior, the goddess, despite being queen in the sense that her title Sharati refers to the feminine aspect of rulership, is yet to be claimed as being like the king in the way that the king is said to be like deities, including Ashur, Marduk, and Ninurta. Most plausibly, this is in part yet to be fully apprehended because Ishtar is typically perceived as an ambiguously, though ultimately female deity, whereas scholarship on the image of the king has often centered on his violent, despotic, or hegemonic masculinity. In this vein, the ending passage of the Zincirli stele inscription has often been understood as being about the subjugation of the enemy by the stripping away of masculine agency. However, to attempt to see the monument in the context of the Assyrian royal stele tradition, it is clear that Esarhaddon's binding of the enemies is articulated not as an act of humiliation for humiliation's sake, but as a transformative action performed on behalf of and in the service of the gods. Further light can be shed on this by looking at the royal inscriptions of Esarhaddon and Assurbanipal, where there is at various times a 2-stage process involving gender transformation and then religious conversion. Interpreted within this framework, the transformation of the captives on the stele can likewise be seen to reflect a religious change performed by Ishtar through Esarhaddon to bind them to support Assurbanipal's rulership, recalling the binding function of the Ade for the foreign vassal rulers. Ishtar's much discussed ambiguous gender identity and connection to gender nonconformity, in fact, further heightens the possibilities for similarity with Esarhaddon then, and furthermore opens intriguing lines of inquiry given the reception of the Assyrian rulers as effeminates by the ancient Greek historians and those that followed them. In this sense, Ishtar may serve as an entry point into and category through which the gendered complexity of late Assyrian royal ideology may continue to be reassessed. Zooming back out, Esarhaddon's appeal to Ishtar to sanctify his connection to Assurbanipal offers further insight into ideological developments under the Sargonids concerning Assyrian royal women, especially the often remarked upon prominence of Esarhaddon's mother, Nakia, who of course imposed the only known Ade attributed to a person other than the king on Šamaš-šumu-ukīn and other members of the royal family, reaffirming the agreement of 672 following Esarhaddon's death in 669 BC. It has been suggested already that the development of Nakia's public image and incorporation into monumental royal imagery was intended to distribute power to her in anticipation as her future role as broker of the succession. I would suggest that Esarhaddon's use of the nose robe to support Assurbanipal may be further situated within this broader development to bring the royal kinship structure to the forefront of visual representations. Certainly, this is the ideological background behind this representation of Nakia on the bronze fragment now in the Louvre, which the inscription informs likely derives from a piece of cult furniture and shows her prominently in a cultic setting. So wrapping up this exploration, I have proposed that Esarhaddon's overlooked visual relationship with Assurbanipal, which is maintained across all three steles, and relative proximity to Assyria's deities, especially on the Zincirli stele, is key to understanding the monument's distributed message about the Sargonids' divinized dynastic right to rule, which is otherwise expressed through rituals. While much about the messages communicated and exported through the Ade and the steles were coherent, there are notable differences. Whereas Assurbanipal's connections to the god Nabu were foregrounded during the crown prince's installation, the steles draw no explicit connections between Assurbanipal and Nabu. In these representations, he is instead connected to the Assyrian gods more generally, and through Esarhaddon's subtle assumption of the role of bestower of rulership and deliverer of enemies, Ishtar in particular. This exploration goes some way to answering the question of divine kingship in 1st millennium BC Assyria by refocusing it. While there is no doubt that the king was the central star in the constellation of Assyrian rulership, his sovereignty was situated within a reinforcing kinship structure that depended on various gendered divinities, and so principles manifested in a network of implicated earthly bodies, as well as crucially corresponding attributes. In the context of Assyrian imperialism and the continual threat of dynastic catastrophe, what appears to be the development to articulate rulership through the universal symbol of the sanctified family on the monumental scale, whether through massive sculptures or grand ceremonials, considering what we know about Nakia's status is at least coherent politically. The question, of course, remains as to whether the apparent development to represent this intimate unit as the heartbeat of empire Assurbanipal can be seen as a fulfillment of this tendency or merely an accident of discovery. In future stages of my research, I hope to address this and related inquiries. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Talah, thank you very much indeed for that wonderfully rich lecture. Lots of virtual clapping going on in the audience. So thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure it will have generated all sorts of thoughts and questions. And I'm just going to allow participants to start their videos and unmute, and of course, raise their hands if they have anything they'd like to share with you. Does anyone like to start things rolling? I may not be able to see everyone, so you might just want to talk. anyone have any questions or comments for Talah? Ah, brilliant, Jesse. Thank you. Please go ahead.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Talah. This was really, really interesting. I was wondering if you have any thoughts, given the sort of focus on continuity, kinship, and the visual reliefs. The very last slide you ended with had a lot of unbearded courtiers, so presumably Sharashis. And if you have thoughts on the role that the Sharashi is playing in this sort of construction of kinship and configuration that's going on visually and presumably also to some degree within the court structure itself.
Hi, Jesse. Yes, thank you for the question. So this is one of the central areas that I will be looking at in the Sargon, the second part of the thesis, particularly. I think we see obviously these really long, impressive processions where you see, possibly the crown prince, though sometimes the head is not fully there, so you can't really tell the headdress. But I think that the kin relations definitely extend out, and I feel like they are being represented as part of this broader family, and this broader network. So yes, more on that soon. I hope to be able to share. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Joanne, you have...
Oh, just a few things on Nabu and Marduk. To know is that in Assyrian cult, the king usually in the Babylonian, their version of the Babylonian, what's called the Babylonian New Year's festival, there's an Assyrian version that's celebrated in Assyria. And in that version, the king plays the role of Marduk. Reigning king plays the role of Marduk in that. So that's not something that would be an innovation, particularly of Esarhaddon. It's sort of the sort of Marduk Nabu trajectory for the king and the crown prince, which is just quite real. I would suggest that the ARWA date was actually chosen because that's Nabu's Akitu. In other words, that was the reason for the choice of that particular thing, is that. And the other thing is just to mention in passing is that, among other things, Nabu was the protector. He takes over Ninurta's role of the protector of oaths and treaties. So again, he's very appropriate choice. And for the that's Mithra, who was also the protector of oaths and treaties. And that is why they smashed those tablets were smashed, is that those oaths were binding on them in a very real way, and kept in the Nabu temple. So they had to cancel them. Basically, they're canceling them by smashing them to bits. So it's just an interesting dynamic of that and sort of the whole complexion of things. So yeah, okay, that's all.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. Any other comments or thoughts? Well, in which case, it just leaves me to again thank Talah for that wonderful talk. And we all look forward, of course, to seeing this in print forthcoming. But for the meanwhile, thank you all very much indeed for attending. Just a reminder, there's no talk next week. We'll reconvene on the 2nd of June for our next talk. But until then, wish you all well. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you.